A former North Dakota alternate dairy princess, and should the dairy princess not be able to complete her duties, I am willing and able to step in at any moment and complete my duties from the early 90s. But a very fun thing and a great hearty conversation if you ever want to know how many squirts of milk are in a pail. I know stuff.
How many?
471. Don't know how they measured and don't know how big the pail was, but that was the number I was told. Yes. I have a good cow story. So I grew up on a dairy farm, obviously, and my dad is, picture a big John Wayne guy. Like, that's it. I've never seen him in anything but cowboy boots, cowboy hat, and a cowboy shirt. Like, that's what he wears. He remembers wearing like a pair of shoes when he was 9. And other than that, cowboy boots. But my parents were gone one day. And so cows have to be milked. It's a regular thing. You milk in the morning, you milk in the afternoon, and there's a set time for both of those occurrences. Well, my parents were in the big city of Bismarck, North Dakota, and they didn't come home at the time at which you milk cows. And about 2.5, 3 hours later, they were still not there, which is a very bad thing in cow universe. Cows get engorged, and that's bad for milks and bad for all of the things that cows do to produce milk. So I thought I was going to be smart. I was 12 years old. I went to the barn. I set up the whole barn because I'd watched them do it all the time. I had 3 rounds of cows milked before my dad got home, and all I could think of was, oh, he's going to be so proud of me. He's just going to be so proud of me. He's going to come and he's going to be like, Sandy, you're such a good daughter. I can't believe how good you are. I was just waiting for it. Well, my dad got home, and he walked into the barn, and he looked at me, and he goes, huh, this is your job now. And he left. And that taught me a very, very, very important lesson about leadership that I think probably all of you have learned. And that is, if you show up, you've got the job. And so how many of you, out of curiosity, thought about getting involved with a board or thought it might be fun to network, and so you got involved with IABC? Raise of hands. How many of you accidentally ended up as a board president because of this thought? Some of us ended up as region presidents because of this thought. So we are people who showed up, and that's okay. And sometimes Dad walking into the barn and saying, this is your job, might be an okay thing. And that's what brought all of you here today to be a part of this. And so Tracy asked me to talk a little bit about how IABC helped my career and how that came to be. And I think that resulted in a conversation we had. She stupidly thought, hey, it might be curious to find out what's going on the regional level. And so she called me and we had coffee, and she said, do you think this made a difference in your career and your life? And I said, absolutely. And here's why. And so I'm here to share that a little bit with you today. So we're going to talk a bit about my ABC journey, what brought me here, what I think helped amp up in my career because of being involved, and then a little bit about how that has created a lifetime commitment to leading from behind, and I'll explain that in a bit. I started at IABC, much like it was referenced earlier. I feel like I'm going to be a little bit of Department of Duplication department, because you've talked about a lot of great things today, right? And so I started in a student chapter. One of the suggestions today was get active in those arenas. Well, we had a really good IABC member in my college, and she recruited people, and we got involved as student members in the Great Plains region, in the Great Plains chapter, and that led to me obviously jumping onto a board. It led to my first job, which led to my second job, and that led to my third job, all because of connections from IABC. And in terms of weird things that can happen, I got engaged at a leadership institute in St. Louis in 1998. So I feel like you are a part of my life no matter how, and like if this marriage doesn't work, it's your fault. But we've been, I'm 20 years in and so far so good. So I think that's a good thing. So long story short, I somehow went from being I've been a one-stop shop most of my career, PR, communications, media, marketing, you name it. And I did that until I got to a team, and then from that team somehow found my way in leadership, and now I'm the Deputy Tax Commissioner for the State of North Dakota, and I'm a communicator. Right? That makes no sense. None. Absolutely none. And so I'm going to explain how I think that happened. I'm really not sure, but I think I know. So this is a reference to my husband. This is beautiful Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota. If you ever get the opportunity, it is gorgeous. My husband and I have 2 different capacities for nature. I like to wander around and look at it lovingly and think, oh, this is my place. My husband looks at it once and says, I get it, it's pretty. It's next. This is a 26-mile loop that you can drive on through Theodore Roosevelt National Park. If you do it at 60, 75, you'll see it really, really quickly because he gets it. It's pretty. He's somebody that needs to move on to the next thing. And so really, what brought me into leadership at IABC, I started at that chapter level, right? We know that value. We see that value in our members there. And we connect with it there because it's engaging and it's interacting. But the Pacific Plains region was like over here, and international was like, I don't know, what do they do for me? I don't get that. So my journey with IABC really started because of my favorite radio station, right? What's in it for me? I really questioned, what does IABC International, why am I sending this $300 and something check to this agency when I'm over here at my local chapter getting that value, right? And so I had a really great mentor who happened to be my boss at the time. Her name was Tracy Finneman. She was very involved in IABC, was my mentor, shadowed her in college, and eventually went to work for her. And she said, you know what? You never know what it's worth until you go experience it. And so I had the opportunity to go to a national conference, or international conference, met lots of wonderful people, and she encouraged me to think about that PPR board. And so, stupidly, I did apply for a PPR board position. And they said, you know what? We need a VP. And I don't do a lot of math because we're communicators. We think we don't do that, right? Yes. But in the end, I went, okay, if I come on as a chapter advocate, they've got me for at least 2 or 3 years. And then they're going to ask me to VP, and I'm going to have to be there for 6. But if I come in as a VP, I'm only going to have to do 3 years. So I looked at it from a sentencing standpoint and decided that was getting off early. Okay? But she talked me into getting on the board. I was able to do that. And one of the questions I really wanted to answer, beside what does PPR do and what does the International Association do for me, was I'm from North Dakota. We think that we might be less than sometimes because we're kind of up there in the middle of nowhere, and you've got all these great cities and big states who have great places all around us. And we are really, we're German-Norwegian heritage, which in its fabric is made up of guilt, self-deprecation, and humbleness. And so I wasn't sure I could run with corporate big dogs. I was a little girl from a dairy farm in North Dakota who worked for some agencies in state government. And so I didn't know if what I thought my talents were even were equivalent to what I thought the world was. And so IABC became a playground for me to figure that out and learn that not only can I be in that group of people, but we can be mentors to each other and learn from each other. And I don't know if you've noticed, the Midwest isn't super diverse. And at North Dakota at that point in time, like we had like 3 people of a different ethnic background than me in my whole city at one point. Like there wasn't a lot of diversity. So IABC got to expose me to that as well. And that was a really good lesson. So I went from chief questioner to a VP in the PPR board. And for reference, one of the things I like to tell people is when you meet somebody from the Midwest, does anybody here know Garrison Keillor? I know we've got Minnesotans in the room, right? Garrison Keillor ends his radio program with Minnesota, where the introverts look at their shoes and the extroverts look at your shoes, right? So coming from the Midwest into this big international association opened my eyes, and it took them off of my shoes and gave me a broader perspective of what that looked like across the world, which was very cool. So amazing people in this room. I got to work with these amazing people. These were folks at a chapter leader meeting just like this about 7, 8 years ago. Great folks, and I had a wonderful group of people to work with. But we had some big issues. Can you guess what they were? We had chapters that were in crisis. We had, let's see, chapters that were doing well. We had chapters that were dissolving. Oh, international was a mess. We had a new CEO, and like things were changing, and you know what, the website didn't work, and we weren't too sure about what that was, and wait, membership was kind of funky, and And it just felt like a flashback to me this morning. Like I was transported in time, like back when I wasn't a dead president. Like it was like happening at real time, because those issues kind of don't go away. Those questions we ask ourselves about value at the chapter level, value at the region level, value at the international level, and that chain of how all that works is a hot mess all the time. And even when one thing's going good, something else isn't going good, right? And it's a balancing act. And so much of the conversation I heard here this morning is very reminiscent of 7 to 10 years ago. Maybe a little different, maybe shaped a little different, but very similar issues, right? So we dealt with 4 things when I was really on the PPR board. Time, money, people, and growth. So we were at a point in time when we had an annual conference. We were doing that regularly, and we'd had a couple that weren't so profitable. And so lo and behold, we found ourselves in a situation similar to what some of our chapters faced, right? Do we have enough to go forward? What do we need to do? How do we approach that? And so we started to think about that perspective of how do we be good custodians, right? I like the conversation from earlier today about the finance manager, right? It's not the finance manager's job to run all the finances for the board. It's the board's job, right? And so how do we collectively do that? And I had a lot of old folks and new folks, and I don't mean old folks in a bad way. Wisdom team, right? People who had built the region up to what it was, who had created the conference, who had created this revenue generation, and I had new folks who were going, something's not working, it's broken, something's not making money, how do we do this? And so we had kind of these 2 factions of people, and nobody really wanted to make that decision. And it was a hard thing to try and understand and look at what that looks like. And so in that role, we still wanted to have fun, right? Laughter for me is something that has to happen. It's an expectation. And how do we be good servants and lead our group with the best possible outcome? And so we looked at a number of things. How do we get better? How do we remove barriers for the region? How do we remove barriers for our chapter? But all in all, we still had to answer the question of, do we have a conference or don't we have a conference? And absolutely nobody wanted to make that decision. And I landed about right here. What do you do when you don't know what to do, right? So I had a great wisdom team. I had some great new blood, and nobody wanted to talk about the thing we didn't want to talk about. And so we went through a process, and it was a difficult thing, because what is the one thing we are all as board members? Does anybody know? Overworked, underpaid, overtaxed. Nope, you're the V word. You're volunteers, which is the most valuable commodity on earth after printer ink. That's the first, but right after printer ink, volunteers. Because we all give one thing that's so incredibly valuable, and that's our time. And so how do you take time from people, make a decision that can be a group decision and be supported by a team that needs to help lead a region and a chapter to move forward? So we really looked at how do we be everyday leaders. And remember earlier when I said, what's the one thing we've all done, right? We showed up. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is show up. And so I showed up to the meeting where we were going to have to make a decision in regards to if we were going to have a conference or not. And I practiced this. This is my word. Flirting. Failing while learning. And I got really comfortable with it, because in a board role, you have to be somewhat vulnerable to the things that come to you, right? And so we practiced a little bit of flirting in this discussion, in this decision. And we went around the table and we talked about those 4 things I mentioned. Time. Do we have the time to commit to this? Do we have a place we can do it? Absolutely, we could do a conference in this place. Do we have money? Well, we have enough money to run it. We've lost money, but we could take a risk and see if we make money. Do we have support? Sure, we have people who will come. They'll support us in that. The one thing we didn't have was the V word. Volunteers. We had burned out our volunteer base, and we didn't have anybody who could support it. And so we made a really hard decision that year. We went around the table and had a really good discussion. and got to the point where we could look at each other and say, I don't know if this is the right decision. I don't know if we should go forward with this. And we went around the room and we asked everybody in that room to make a commitment. What do you think we should do, yes or no? And so the people who had been there that started it, that brought the baby to life, that had grown it and groomed it, were able to say, this isn't the right thing for us as a group right now. And so we made some hard decisions, and we didn't stop it. We hit pause, and we took a break and refreshed. So I'm excited to be here, because this is like the first conference since I took it all down. No, that's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. But it was a really strategic leadership decision based around our finances and what we could do, and we looked for other ways to generate revenue in the gap of that. But it goes back to that discussion, right? All of the problems I thought we had 7 years ago are still problems today. They just look different. And as leaders, being vulnerable and being able to change with that is so incredibly important, because the only way that you innovate is through change. And sometimes that means looking at things a little differently. The world's most fearsome predator. Think he's got issues? Right? He's one of my favorite things. You get to see him. He hates presents. He hates push-ups. He can't do stuff. Oh my God, no arms. But in the end, even the world's most fearsome predator was vulnerable in many ways. But he overcame things in his universe with his strengths, right? If you can rip somebody's face off with your mouth, you don't need your hands. What do you need those for? Those are useless. But that's kind of how we approached it from a board vision. We looked at where our blind spots were. We looked at what strengths and weaknesses we had. And as board members, whether that's finances, whether that's chapters, whether that's members, whether that's volunteers, sometimes that's the piece you have to look at. What's your vulnerable piece? Where are the barriers? And how do you break that down? T-Rex is extinct, so maybe the vulnerability thing doesn't work great. This is one of my favorite quotes in vulnerability. If you haven't looked up Brené Brown on TED, do it. She's wonderful. But vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up. And it's not a weakness. And for many years in my role, because I was from North Dakota, where humbleness and self-deprecation is the fabric of all we are, I really thought maybe I wasn't enough. And so stepping back from that and really approaching it from an idea that maybe that particular thing about us as board members is what makes us the strongest. Because you have to be able to face that and make good decisions and lead around it. One of the things that I think is so important is one of my mentors told me, you are the right leader at the right moment. And sometimes we aren't sure about that, right? We don't know if we're the right fit for that space. But again, you showed up. You care enough to make a difference. And so you could just be the right leader. Sometimes you have to get around the baggage. Does anybody know the Pretty Lady and the Monk story? This is one of my favorite. This changed my entire universe. Changed the way I looked at myself and the way I looked at my career. And I think, in combination with IABC, really kind of gave me the ability to flip things around. So The Pretty Lady and the Monks is a story about two monks, a junior monk and a senior monk. And they're walking along on a journey, and they come to a river with a very, very strong current. And they find a young woman standing there, and she doesn't know how to get across because the current's so strong, so she asks for help. And as monks, they had taken a vow to never touch a woman. Well, after the woman asked for help, the senior monk picked her up, put her on his shoulders, and walked her across the river, put her down on the other side, and he kept journeying on with his junior monk. An hour goes by, and the junior monk thinks, I can't believe he touched that woman. And 2 hours go by, and 3 hours go by, and the junior monk's frustration continues to grow, until finally he turns around and says, how could you do that? We have vowed to never touch a woman. How could you just touch that woman and do that thing? And the very wise monk looked at him and said, I put her down after we crossed the river, and you've been carrying her this whole time. Right? It's that perspective. And so sometimes I think as chapter leaders, as regional leaders, as international leaders, on boards that you serve on in your community, we get caught on the baggage, the what was there before, or the what might have happened, and it's sometimes hard to walk around that. And so I always think of the monks, because in the end, that baggage is something we need to move past, because it only gets in the way. And so sometimes flirting your way around it is the best way, because how did you learn when you started to walk? You fell down and you got up again. And so sometimes that's okay to look at it from that perspective. For me, I learned very quickly. I went through my first round of IABC PPR. I came back and I made it to the big table. That's what I call the room where you have all the meetings with, where all the really important people sit. Didn't even know if I wanted to be there, but I made it. And I figured out that I belonged. And one of the things that was so important to me in the end was I found out that I belonged the way I was, not the way I thought I had to be a part of the board, to be a part of the table, to be there. I think we get so caught up on the leader we're supposed to be that we forget to be the leader that we are. This was my group. I worked for a period of time at the Department of Commerce, which handled tourism and economic development for the state of North Dakota, so I got to be one of the state's chief cheerleaders. And we did this as a bottle of wine for our staff. We put labels on the wine and said, "We might be the reason you drink." And so that was our picture for that. And trust me, there are people in that picture that did not like to do that, but they did it because it was fun and it was a good thing for our team. Being authentic is not easy. One of the things I want you to think about, and they mentioned this earlier, was perspective. And one of my favorite slides for perspective is this. Does anybody know the secret of bats? Bats are awesome because if you look at them like this, they're bats. But if you flip them upside down, they are rapping like just the best dancers ever. It's like, right? Because sometimes when you flip the problem on its head, it looks completely different. And so I love bats as a great way that most people are scared of bats. And when they're hanging upside down and they're kind of in this role, gosh, nobody likes that. But man, they look badass. They are groovy. And sometimes taking a different look and dumping that baggage, right? Setting down that beautiful lady after we cross the river is what it takes to see something from a new perspective. And that sounds very much like the IABC of old and the IABC of current. As leaders, we're taking a new look, and what does that look like? So one of the things that came out of all that for me is I had good options. Through IABC, I could say that I had helped lead a team. I'd helped manage a budget. I'd helped learn how to handle and manage people of very different personalities and backgrounds. I could talk about how I supported change through good discernment of problems and issues. And so when my agency had lost a deputy, and if you've ever worked in state government or don't know anything about it, a deputy is kind of the person who helps run the agency. They handle the strategic leadership and communication, organizational structure, and oversee that across the thing. So I went to my boss and I said, "Please, sir, I want some more. I think you need a deputy." And he said, "Oh, really? Who do you think that should be?" I said, "Well, I have made an assessment of our team and I think you have two options if you're going to pick in-house." And he said, "Who would that be?" I said, "Well, one of them's me and I think I would be good at it." And he said, "Oh, really? And who's the other one?" I said, "Well, it's Justin. And really, if you want a really good team, you want both of us. Because he can do the policy stuff, but he sucks at the people, and I'm really good at the people. So why don't you make us both your deputy, and we'll help run the agency." And he said, "Well, thank you for that really pushy conversation, young lady." No, but he was very good at listening. But I wouldn't have the courage to do that, and I wouldn't have had a way to back it up if it hadn't been for IABC and the experiences I had here. And in the end, I ended up with wanting some more. I ended up as a co-deputy of the agency for a period of time. And as state governments do, we had a new governor come in and there was some transition there. And in that time before that, I got to lead our leadership effort. We created an entire culture engagement program for our staff, and I became a culture addict and what it takes to build trust in an organization. And I went from being a communicator to somebody who thinks strategic leadership, and thinking about that in a robust way is so important to the health of an organization and the growing of a team. And it was really, really cool. And sometimes it goes sideways. That new administration came with some baggage too. I'd been at the state for almost 10 years. In their eyes, that made me a dinosaur who couldn't have any new ideas. And so sometimes as a leader, you have to decide how to transition out. And so I made a distinct commitment to helping that agency transition into new leadership and helping that succession happen. And I found a new path. And I landed it 10 tax, which doesn't make any sense to me at all, except if you put this on a Scrabble board, that's like 10 points. It's a little less than you like if you use sex, which is another good 3-letter word, but tax is almost as good. And that's a lot of math for me, right? But tax came a-calling and wondered. I had worked with the commissioner who is currently the only elected tax commissioner in the entire US. We had worked together for a brief period of time at Commerce, and he came and said, hey, we just did an employee survey, and it's ugly. We found out that our staff's not very happy, and we don't know what to do about it because we're accountants and auditors. Is anybody in here accountants and auditors? Good, we're going to talk freely. So I said, tell me a little bit more about it. So we talked, and he really wanted somebody to come in and transform the agency. It was an agency that had a lot of people who said things, and still do, like, that's not the way we do it here. Well, but this is the way we do it. We can't change that. We've never done it that way before. And so my job is to come and help change that agency over with some strategic leadership. So I get to do this. I scare auditors daily, because rules are like guidelines for me, and for auditors that is hellish scary. But I'm talking to them about strategic communication. We're looking at organizational leadership and how you build trust in a team to create high-performing teams. We're looking at how we culture build and create that staff engagement among our staff. And I would throw warm, fuzzy crap at them because that's what they think it is. It's just good communication. But why would we tell people stuff? That's a whole new element for them. But in my role, I get to do that. And then we have the one thing that we shall not speak of, and that's succession planning. I work for an agency that 25% of that staff is going to turn over in the next 5 years. I have 120 employees. Do you know how much knowledge? I have 40, 45, 50-year employees who have worked at that agency. So now think about that as a leader in your organizations, right? PPR, how hard is it to transfer, or in Southern, that information from one board member to the next, or in our chapters, right? And so thinking about how we foster the next generation and how we cultivate that leadership for the next round is so critically important. And so I like to think of it like Jerry Maguire. Anybody here know what Jerry Maguire is? Good, I'm starting to age, so I make references and forget that people don't always know what the heck I'm talking about. But there's this great scene in Jerry Maguire where he talks about his mentor. And his mentor says, you gotta always be closing, because they're doing deals, right? You gotta be closing. Well, I am always recruiting. I think my job as a leader is to work myself out of a job. My job is to foster my entire team to come up to a level that I'm not important anymore and I'm not necessary. Because I like to build things and leave them, because then they're boring. Once they work, I don't care. Let's go do something new. But our job as leaders is to be thinking about who's the next generation. The example of putting somebody to LI because you get that commitment, that's showing value and investing in our people, right? Somebody invested in me, and now I got to pay them back by investing in the next generation. And so as leaders, think about that. When you see the young recruit, I'm out talking about how I amped my career, because as a small town girl in Bismarck, North Dakota, my opportunities for strategic leadership in a one-stop shop were a lot smaller, but not at all, because I had IABC to help move that. So when I talk to young people, or people that are my age or older who haven't connected with an organization like IABC, that's what I talk about. Because organizations are struggling there. I mean, how many kids have you talked to that say, God, that Lions group, Optimus? We're so joining a fraternal organization. Board leadership? Count me in, Robert's Rules of Order. Right? No. Nobody is talking about that. And that level of formal authority is gross to our next generation. They are appalled at that. And so how are we going to engage them? How are we going to talk about the difference they can make? And how are we going to step away from, but that's how we've always been, right? There's been some great ideas in this room today, and our job as leaders is to foster that forward, build that culture, foster a legacy of leadership. Guess where I've learned all that? I learned it here in IABC. So always be recruiting, think about that, and think about how you're going to build a legacy. My commitment is to lead from behind. And picture. I'm a country kid. And when you herd a bunch of cattle, you don't get in front and go, hey cows, come on, this way, let's go. Cows don't do that. But if you get behind them and you push gently from behind and you grab the edges a little here and you grab the edges a little there, they will go where you want them to go. And it takes soft, gentle leadership to help them get there. And so that's how I see my role with my teams and those that I foster in this board and others. Because I love when somebody says, well, leadership's not easy. No, it's a lot of work. And I always say, do the math. How many leaders are there? How many non-leaders are there? There's not as many in this hand because it's hard. And it's work. And it takes people who show up even when it is. And earlier I talked about in learning that it takes grit, right? And grit, I love that word because grit says you're going to get a little dirty. You might take a bullet and some soft fleshy tissue, not any important stuff, but soft fleshy tissue, you might have to take one or two. And sometimes you have to push through that to lead your team. So that's what leading from behind is. And that commitment of that is something I ask all of you to think about. Because it only takes a few of us to make a difference, but we still got to show up. Kind of on a personal note, IABC also taught me how to be scared. So my husband and I, 5 years ago this month, did something really stupid. After my oldest son has Down syndrome, and we've been dreaming since he was a little boy of finding some place for him to work. I don't like the systems that are out there. If you have a disability, you may be able to get a job, but you can't work over so many hours or you lose your services for this or that. If you make too much money, you lose your Social Security income. There's a whole structure that limits your ability to succeed. And so I'm going to break it. That was what we decided to do. And so we have a local library where there's a coffee shop, and we happened to go in. We were going on vacation and asked about, hey, if you're ever interested in selling at this shop someday, we'd love to have a conversation. He was 9 at the time, and we were thinking, 13 at the time, and we were thinking 5-6 years would be great. Well, a month and a half later, I owned a coffee shop. Don't know how, don't know why. And what I learned is if it scares you, it might be right. And so because I'd been in IABC and had learned many of those leadership qualities, those business aspects, that all came with me to this adventure as well. And we're celebrating 5 years, and that guy's going to graduate, and unless he becomes a really famous vlogger or a ghost hunter, which are the other two things in front of coffee shop, he's going to work at a coffee shop. So when I started to look at IABC and I look back on my journey, and I asked myself, what's in it for me? A lot. What I learned was a lot. And I'm taking different pieces from different elements at different times. My chapter provided something for a long time. I'm now in that Wisdom Dead Presidents Club and finding a way to re-engage. The region taught me that the way you foster leaders across 19 states is you take the time to do it, and you do it at the regional level. And what I learned at International is there are so many great people who can be your coaches and mentors, and it doesn't matter if they're a fellow or they've got alphabet soup behind their name, they will talk to you because you belong to this, and it's important. And so I hope what's in it for me ends up being what's in it for you, that whether it amps your career or changes the way you lead, look to that future. How do you foster that legacy? Because you don't want to do this forever, right? It'll burn you out. You have to find people to replace you. So foster that legacy. Think about how you lead from behind. And in the end, know you're the right leaders at the right time because you're here. And I want to leave you with this thought. This is another Brené Brown. Authenticity is the practice of letting go of who we think we're supposed to be and embracing who we are. And so I hope that you embrace yourselves today and, like this here. And know that in the end, sometimes a thankless job, because board leadership can be a thankless job, can also be a really rewarding one. And so with that, I want you to all stick your hand in the air, right? Turn it towards the back like this, and make sharp up and down motions. Good job. Good job, leaders. Because sometimes you have to know how to thank yourselves, and I thank you for being here with me today. And with that, learn long and prosper.